Hi there, and welcome to this latest in a series of online video lessons intended to provide you important principles and handy tips to develop your understanding and practice of argumentation. In this lesson, we're going to learn about the theoretical contribution of a British philosopher of the 20th century that would forever shape the way we understand how arguments are constructed and understood. And this is going to be a theory of understanding the logical perspective of argument, which we'll briefly review at the beginning of this lesson, that is important not just for those of us who want to put together arguments that are logically sound and therefore more persuasive, but also for those of us that want to be a critical consumer of argument and therefore be able to analyze and evaluate the logical soundness of arguments. That British philosopher is Stephen Toulmin, and the method that he developed for understanding the structure of argument is generally referred to in our field pretty simply as the Toulman model of argument analysis. Once you understand the Toulman model, you'll have a really helpful template for understanding how arguments are put together and what are the various pieces of argument that a critic can examine in order to understand what the strengths and potential logical weakness of an argument might be. But first of all, let's get the big picture. In a previous lesson in this series, we talked about three perspectives for understanding argumentation: the dialectical perspective, the rhetorical perspective, and the logical perspective. When we think about argumentation from a logical standpoint, we're thinking about argument in the following way. This perspective emphasizes the accuracy of the premises and the correctness of the inferences linking premises and evidence to the claims they support. Now, what argumentation scholars Inch and Tudor mean by this definition is what we are essentially concerned with is an argument that's constructed and presented as a product for audience consumption, for which we are especially interested in whether or not it is true. And the truth or falsity of an argument is something that, of course, is absolutely crucial to those of us who want to pass judgments based on a sound foundation. So there are a variety of different ways of understanding how we can look at argument from a logical perspective. And some of them go all the way back to the philosophy of ancient Greece, where dialectics and the development of such symbolic logic structures as the syllogism were originally developed. But around the middle part of the 20th century, there are a number of scholars in Europe as well as in the United States that are wondering whether or not there might be a better way to understand how argument operates than the broad abstractions of symbolic logic from a philosophy perspective. One of those folks was Stephen Toulmin, born in 1912, died in 1984. This is a Londoner who, interestingly, as a philosopher, was very active for the British military in World War II. He engaged in technology research, and he was also involved in intelligence gathering and analysis. And one of the things that's really important to understand about Toulmin, as well as other argumentation theorists of his time, such as Klien in Belgium, is that because of the threat of Nazi Germany to the world, what these folks were recognizing was a real contradistinction between the development of technology on the one hand, which many of us in Western civilization tend to lionize as something that's inherently positive, with the development of a machine of war that literally threatened the security of the world and was responsible for the murder of millions of people. So after World War II, Toulmin is especially interested from a philosophical standpoint in thinking about the philosophy of science and the philosophy of law. What he wanted to try to do was to figure out how is it that we can approach these kinds of fields of inquiry using an approach to understanding and evaluating argument in ways that are much more practical and much more grounded in human bodies of information that are specific, such as science and such as law. He was a bit dissatisfied with the broad abstractions of symbolic logic, which are really helpful if you're thinking about bigger picture philosophical intellectual exercises. But when you're getting down to the nitty-gritty pragmatics of what human beings do and how they make decisions, the broadness of symbolic logic really doesn't get us where we need to be. So he writes a book in 1958 called The Uses of Argument. And what he does in this book is develops a theory of practical reasoning that improves on formal logic. He maintains a structure of argument that we can see the seeds of all the way back to the theory of Aristotle's rhetoric back in ancient Greece. But what he's especially looking at is how we can analyze the structure of this argument based not just on broader patterns of reasoning that might apply to any argument, but also to look at the specific kinds of reasoning that we engage in when we're looking at specific fields of endeavor, such as science or the law. Toulman, for instance, in the uses of argument, develops an idea that he refers to as argument fields, which essentially means that a lot of the reasoning that we do in arguments that exist within a particular context can only be understood within that particular field of argument, an area of intellectual inquiry, knowledge, and experience that's very specific to that area. So, for instance, experimental scientists in fields like biology or chemistry engage in certain norms for understanding what constitutes a valid theory, what constitutes good research, what constitutes the right sort of evidence to back up a claim. And those kinds of norms for understanding what is reasonable argument is very different than, say, in an argument field such as law, where what constitutes the right kind of reasoning, the kinds of evidence that we find from legal precedents from prior cases, and how they apply to future circumstances. Lawyers argue and reason in very different ways than biochemists do, and they reason and argue in very different ways than theologians do, and so on and so forth. So Toulman devises a way to think about argument that both can apply to specific argument fields and specific areas of inquiry, but can also apply more broadly to the kind of practical arguments that take place in the human public sphere. Now, Toulman is not a rhetorician, he's a philosopher, but his work had a profound influence on the rhetoric and communication scholarship that started to be developed in the 1950s, around the same time as Toulman was operating in England. And argumentation scholars in the United States especially gravitated towards Toulman as a sound theoretical foundation for understanding how argument works. Okay, so we know that Toulman's a neat guy and he made some big contributions, but let's get at what this theory actually gets at. Now, some of his model of argument is going to seem very familiar to those of you that have been following previous lessons in this series. The core of the argument is something that, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, goes all the way back to the model of a basic argument that gets developed in ancient Greek rhetoric. So, for instance, the three primary pieces of argument are a claim, which we can understand as the position that's being asserted as true. The second piece is what Toulman refers to as data, and sometimes other folks using Toulman's ideas might refer to it as grounds. But what we really mean here is the evidence that's being used to prove the claim. And finally, Toulman describes the third piece of the argument core as a warrant, but what those of us who have studied this topic previously can understand more simply as reasoning. And Toulman describes a warrant, describes the reasoning process as an inference that provides a rational link that connects the data to the claim. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the contributions of Toulman's theory is that this kind of reasoning, this kind of warrant that links the data to the claim, can either be field invariant, in other words, it can be a pattern of reasoning such as the use of analogies, the use of rules of thumb, the kinds of reasoning moves that most reasonable people develop over the course of living in human society. Invariant. It can apply to any field of inquiry. On the other hand, warrants can also be field dependent. In other words, the way that the reasoning operates to link the data to the claim might only really make sense if you think about it from the context of a specific argument field, like science or theology or the law. So, this is the core of the argument, and what's helpful about Toulman's model is he depicts it in visual diagrammatic form, so we can actually see the structure of the relationships of the different pieces. So we've got our claim, and the easiest way to think about a claim from Toulman's standpoint is this is the conclusion that I want you to draw. So while the claim is often, although not always, a statement that an arguer is going to make up front, it's actually, in a functional sense, not the first thing that happens, but it's the end result. because what happens is data are presented, in other words, grounds or evidence that's being used to support the claim. So data can be understood very simply as why is the conclusion true? So we can see in this first relationship that's depicted by this arrow that's going in one direction, if the data are true, therefore the claim must be true. There's one more important piece, and that's the warrant. The warrant, of course, is this rational link between the data and the claim. So this upward arrow that connects the two is meant to visually depict that relationship. And remember, we can think about the warrant most simply as why is the data relevant to prove the claim? So in other words, if the evidence is true, so what? How does that evidence prove the claim? In other words, what is the link? So you can think about the warrant as a connection that's being made where you're connecting the dots between the truth of the evidence and the truth of the claim. One important thing to remember about this model as well, since especially it's being informed by the theory of Aristotle's rhetoric and Aristotle's notion of the enthymeme, which is the type of argument that involves pieces that are left unstated or implicit. In many arguments, we don't necessarily provide all of the specific pieces because we know that the audience is going to be able to fill in the blanks. This is often the case with a warrant. Sometimes arguers are going to lay out their reasoning very explicitly so that the connection between the data and the claim is unmistakable. However, in many arguments, if the arguer can assume that the audience is going to be able to fill in the blanks and see what the reasonable relationship is between the data and the claim, the warrant may be unstated but implied. And so what we'll do when we diagram these sorts of arguments is try to make distinctions between pieces of the argument that are explicitly presented by an arguer and pieces of the argument that are implied but can really pretty easily be inferred by somebody who understands the argument in context. Okay, so as to not bore you with the broad generalities of the model, we probably need to start applying it to a specific argument so you can see how the structure plays out. Let me take you back to September 10th, 2013. President Barack Obama is facing a crisis in the Middle East, specifically a civil war that is raging in the nation of Syria, in which the leader of the Syrian regime, Bashar al-Assad, has been found to have used chemical weapons against his own citizens in Syria, resulting in thousands of deaths and injury casualties. And this is, of course, if you're aware of the international law banning chemical weapons as a weapon of mass destruction, something that is pretty hideously awful and is also seen as a serious destabilizing move. So President Obama gave a speech from the White House that night to explain his rationale for why the United States was going to engage in a military strike on Syria. So I'm going to play for you part of that speech now, and what I want you to do is to see if you can pick out what the major claims that he's making are, what sort of evidence or data are he using to support those claims, and does he make explicit moves to connect that evidence to the claim, and or are there moments in which he can leave the reasoning implicit because he can count on you as a reasonably aware person to be able to fill in the blanks.
When dictators commit atrocities, they depend upon the world to look the other way until those horrifying pictures fade from memory. But these things happened. The facts cannot be denied. The question now is what the United States of America and the international community is prepared to do about it. Because what happened to those people, to those children, is not only a violation of international law, it's also a danger to our security. Let me explain why. If we fail to act, the Assad regime will see no reason to stop using chemical weapons. As the ban against these weapons erodes, other tyrants will have no reason to think twice about acquiring poison gas and using them. Over time, our troops would again face the prospect of chemical warfare on the battlefield. And it could be easier for terrorist organizations to obtain these weapons and to use them to attack civilians. If fighting spills beyond Syria's borders, these weapons could threaten allies like Turkey, Jordan, and Israel. And a failure to stand against the use of chemical weapons would weaken prohibitions against other weapons of mass destruction and embolden Assad's ally, Iran, which must decide whether to ignore international law by building a nuclear weapon or to take a more peaceful path. This is not a world we should accept. This is what's at stake. And that is why, after careful deliberation, I determined that it is in the national security interests of the United States to respond to the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons through a targeted military strike. That's my judgment as Commander-in-Chief. But I'm also the president of the world's oldest constitutional democracy. So even though I possess the authority to order military strikes, I believed it was right, in the absence of a direct or imminent threat to our security, to take this debate to Congress. I believe our democracy is stronger when the President acts with the support of Congress. And I believe that America acts more effectively abroad when we stand together. This is especially true after a decade that put more and more war-making power in the hands of the President and more burdens on the shoulders of our troops while sidelining the people's representatives from the critical decisions about when we use force.
Okay, so let's see what kind of sense we can make of this clip from the speech. President Obama provides at one point earlier on in the clip this claim: Assad's use of chemical weapons in spite of the international ban on their use is a threat to U.S. national security. He backs up that claim with the following data. He provides points that if nothing is done, Assad will keep using chemical weapons. And if this is the case, we're going to have other regimes that will seek their own chemical weapons and other forms of weapons of mass destruction, such as the Iranian program to develop nuclear weapons. There's a threat that if this is gone unchecked, then there'll be easier access for terrorists to get their hands on chemical weapons. There's a very great possibility that the fighting is going to go outside of Syria into other areas of the Middle East, and if the WMDs are used there, then U.S. allies in the region are also going to be threatened, not to mention U.S. troops who are supporting those allies. So we've got all of these various pieces of evidence that are being used to support the claim that Assad's use of chemical weapons is a threat to national security. But what we don't have yet in our analysis is how is it that Assad's use of chemical weapons, other regimes trying to get WMDs, easier access of these weapons to terrorists, and the threat of U.S. allies such as Jordan, what do these things have to do with national security? What is the link? And Obama provides it both explicitly and implicitly. But ultimately, what he's getting at is that if we have these kinds of threats to U.S. troops in the region, threats to civilians due to the expansion of conflict, as well as the use of terrorist weapons, as well as threats to U.S. allies, all of these things constitute a threat to U.S. national security. He doesn't come right out and say that, but it's heavily implied by the way that he presents the evidence. And so you can see how the warrant, even though it's unstated, it can be used by the audience to semi-consciously connect the dots. So if Assad is going to keep using these weapons, that's going to threaten U.S. troops and civilians, and threatening U.S. troops and civilians is a threat to our security. Therefore, Assad's use of these weapons is a threat to national security. If Assad's use of weapons are going to lead to other regimes trying to get their own weapons, this threatens U.S. troops and civilians and allies, and that's a threat to national security. Therefore, Assad's use of these weapons is a threat to national security, and so on. So this is a key way to think about warrants. Sometimes they'll be explicitly provided where you can see how the data is connected to the claim, but if the reasoning isn't necessarily laid out explicitly, what you need to do is ask yourself, given the context of disagreement that we're finding in this argument, how do we find a relevant connection? What is the relevant connection between the data and the claim? How is it that that evidence proves the truth of the claim? And so sometimes it's just as simple as providing that very basic relationship, a definition of national security in this context that makes the connecting of the dots between the data and the claim pretty easy. Now, very briefly, just to reinforce how this process works, we can pick up on Obama's argument from this point and see where he gets to the ultimate point, the ultimate claim that he makes in this clip. So, once he establishes this claim's truth, that Assad's use of chemical weapons in spite of the international ban is a threat to U.S. national security, this claim that he's proven now becomes a conclusion that he uses as data for a subsequent claim. So now we have data, evidence. Assad's use of chemical weapons in spite of the international ban is a threat to U.S. national security. What follows after this is some reasoning that he provides both explicitly and then implicitly. He states, this is not a world we should accept. And in this context, the arguer can pretty safely infer that the reason why we don't want to accept a world like this, we don't want our national security threatened. This kind of threat to our existence, this kind of threat to our safety, is not something that we should stand idly by and let happen. Therefore, Obama gets to this conclusion in the claim. The U.S. should respond to Assad's chemical weapons use with a targeted military strike. So you can see between these two diagrams that we've just looked at, we've got a very simple argument chain. He establishes a basic claim that Assad's use of these weapons is a threat to national security. He backs that up with evidence, and the reasoning helps him tie those together. And then once he's established that chunk of the argument, he can use that claim as the basis for his larger proposition, that this is why the targeted military strike that I've ordered is justified. Now, this is the core of an argument, the three basic pieces: claim, data, warrant, or claim, evidence, reasoning. But that's not all there is to it, because Toulman recognized, unlike the broad generalities of symbolic formal logic, when human beings argue, they're arguing potentially about ambiguous things, or arguing about human activities and human fields of endeavor that can often have exceptions or qualifications. We don't necessarily argue all the time in black and white, in absolute truth or absolute falsity. So there's some secondary pieces to the model of argument we need to consider. The first is backing. Toulman talks about backing essentially as evidence or assumptions that support the validity of the warrant. So we don't want to confuse backing with additional evidence that's used to back up the claim. We want to think specifically about the warrant. So you can think about backing as if the warrant establishes a link between the data and the claim, the backing provides evidence to prove that the warrant is true. The next piece is called a qualifier. Toulman describes the qualifier of an argument as the degree of force of the claim. In other words, how true it is. Again, we're not arguing in complete black and white, totally true or totally false. In many human arguments, how true we argue a claim is often qualified with some kind of description, somewhere in the continuum between absolutely true and absolutely false. So you want to think about this in terms of words like mostly true, or in all probability, or based on the available evidence we can conclude, or by the preponderance of the evidence, or beyond a reasonable doubt if we're arguing in court, for instance. Qualifiers essentially tell you how true the claim is. The final piece is referred to by Toulman as the rebuttal, although it's often referred to by Toulman scholars as the reservation. And the rebuttal is that kind of statement that we often make when we're making an argument where we concede that there are conditions of exception to the claim. Sometimes it's going to be valuable not just from a persuasive standpoint, but indeed from a rational, logical standpoint to recognize up front that there's a possibility that my claim might not be correct. I'm pretty confident that it is correct, but if it is wrong, this would be the reason why. And that kind of move can be important to make because you're telling your audience that I recognize that there are limitations to my argument. If you don't make those kinds of limitations explicit, but the audience is able to figure them out, then their confidence in the soundness of your argument can be compromised. So how do these pieces fold into the larger diagram? Well, here's our basic three, right? Claim, data, and warrant. So backing would go here in the diagram, right underneath the warrant with the arrow pointing towards the warrant, because, as we said, what the backing essentially does is provide evidence to answer the question, why is the warrant true? Now again, notice the relationship between backing and warrant. So we don't want to confuse backing with additional evidence that's used to support the claim. You want to think about backing specifically and directly as why is the warrant true? Why is that assumption or premise or logical relationship between the data and the claim, why does that make sense? How do we know that that's sound or valid? Now, the qualifier would go right up here because the data provides the support that establishes the truth of the claim, but the qualifier is going to come in right before the claim is asserted in a functional sense to let us know how true that claim is. So that's the way to think about a qualifier. The claim isn't just true. How true is it? Is it absolutely true? Is it true in all probability? Is it true by a preponderance of the evidence? Is it possibly true? Something like that. Now, it's important to note that not all arguers are necessarily going to put a qualifier into their argument. Unlike a warrant, which can be unstated, but there's always going to be at least some implicit reasoning in an argument, things like backing or a qualifier in particular don't need to be put in there. Sometimes an arguer is going to make a case that this claim is true 100%. So if that would be the case and you're trying to diagram an argument to determine what the pieces are, it's okay to just write none. If, in your estimation as a critic of the argument, the arguer is just not making a qualifier. The same is going to be true of the rebuttal. Now, if a rebuttal is made, it's going to go right in here because the way to think about the rebuttal is essentially this. If the data are true, in other words, if we're convinced that the evidence is true and we can accept it, and if the warrant is sound, in other words, the logic or the rationale or the reasoning of that premise, if we can agree with that, if it makes sense, so the evidence is true and the warrant's true, are there other conditions where, even though those are true, the claim would still be false? This would be those exceptional conditions. And like I said, if there are those exceptional conditions and you recognize them as an arguer, it can be a pretty good idea to just put them out there so that between the combination of the rebuttal and the qualifier, you're letting your arguer know, look, I'm not being irrational or unreasonable about this. I know that there may be some limitations to the truth of this claim, but here's how true I think it is given these limiting conditions. But again, just like the qualifier, it's often the case that arguers are just not going to include a rebuttal or a reservation. They may argue that their claim is true 100%. And so if that's true and you're diagramming this argument, it's totally acceptable to just write none in the rebuttal spot. Then what you do as a critical analyst of an argument is to move from looking at what the pieces are and how they fit together to the process of evaluation. So if you find, for instance, that there's no backing and or no qualifier and or no rebuttal being provided in the argument, then the next question you have to ask yourself is, well, based on what I know about the context of this argument, is that reasonable? If there's no qualifier and no rebuttal, if it's being argued 100% true, is that really justified? Or should there be a qualifier? Should there be a rebuttal that the arguer should be taking into account but really isn't? That can be something that's important to point out so that you can recognize the limitations of the argument's logic. Okay, so enough abstract generalities. Let's get back to President Obama's speech and see how he folds these pieces into his particular argument. Okay, so here's the core of our argument that we analyzed last time. We've got our claim, the U.S. should respond to Assad's chemical weapons use with a targeted military strike. The data, Assad's use of chemical weapons, in spite of the international ban, is a threat to U.S. national security. And the warrant that connects both of these together is this is not a world that we should accept. So where do the other pieces fall into place? Well, we've got the backing. In this case, it's implied, but it's not completely absent. Obama does discuss in the data some specific risks of Assad's use of chemical weapons that explain why the threat to U.S. national security exists. He talks about how civilians can be threatened. He talks about how U.S. troops can be threatened. He talks about how U.S. allies can be threatened. So the reason why we should not accept this threat to national security is because it's risking lives, it's risking resources, it's destabilizing the region. This is bad stuff that we don't want. So it's these specifics about the nature of the threats to national security that provides evidence to back up the warrant. This is not a world we should accept. We cannot take this threat to national security because it's going to kill people and it's going to sap crucial U.S. resources. Okay, so that's the backing. Now notice that President Obama does provide a rebuttal, although it's a bit indirect. He doesn't come right out and say there's a condition under which this claim is false. But notice what he does. He establishes that when he wanted to make the decision to engage in the military strike, he didn't just make that decision unilaterally. He went to Congress and sought their support. And he goes on to describe how, even though he's got the power to make the decision, it's important in a constitutional democracy to see that the civilian leadership has been consulted. It increases the legitimacy of the action, and we've seen the negative consequences of when this kind of military force has been used without congressional oversight. So essentially, he says, without coming right out and saying it, the U.S. should respond to Assad's chemical weapons use with a targeted military strike unless there is significant congressional opposition to the military action. This is what he essentially says, right? If Congress was not on board, I would not be doing this. Okay, so does he provide a qualifier? Well, he does. If you remember what he says right before he provides his claim is he provides this verbal qualification. After careful deliberation, I determined that, and then he provided the statement of his action, which is his claim in this case. So this counts as a qualifier because it tells you Obama's sense of how true the claim is. He determined that this claim is true after careful deliberation. That means that he's not just asserting this is true, he's thought hard about it, he's weighed the pros and cons, he's considered competing arguments for and against this, and after all of that work, this is the conclusion that he came to. So it provides you a sense that he sees that this is true because this is an idea that has been robustly discussed and examined and tested before he actually advocates it. Okay, so now we've got all 6 pieces of the argument laid out. We know what the evidence is that leads to the larger claim. We see that there's a good rational link between the data and the claim, and that link between the data and the claim is backed up by specific factual information that leads to an inference that the audience can pretty easily come to grips with. There is an indirect rebuttal, but nonetheless it is there, recognizing that Obama knows that there are limitations to the truth of his judgment, and therefore he provides this qualifier letting us know how he came to this decision and how true he thinks it is. All right. So what we've got here is a model that provides us a really great template, not just for figuring out how an argument is put together, but also it gives us an opportunity to actually visually see the relationships between the various pieces. We can also use this approach to analysis to see which pieces of the argument are explicitly provided by the arguer, which ones are implicit, and in the case of things like backing, qualifier, and rebuttal, are there pieces of the arguer's argument that are missing, that maybe shouldn't be missing? When we get to the actual step of evaluating the logic of the argument, this template then also provides us with a really good focus point for how do we go about evaluating the argument once we've analyzed it? Well, once we know what the data are, once we know what the evidence is, then we can apply our tests of evidence to see, well, is this good evidence? Once we know what the warrant is, what kind of logical move is linking the data and the claim, we can apply certain tests of reasoning to determine whether or not that link between the data and the claim makes sense. And as we examine the context of the argument and the larger strength of the case that's made by the arguer, we can ask ourselves, well, If the backing's provided, do we buy it? Does it make sense? Is there a qualifier and or a rebuttal that seems to be warranted in this situation? And if so, did the arguer provide it? Did they not? Or perhaps did they provide a qualifier and rebuttal, but maybe they missed some important qualification or rebuttal that they should have taken into account? So, as an analytical tool and as the basis for evaluating the argument and passing judgment on it, the Toulman model really makes things clear and systematic for us. It's just a question of getting comfortable with the process of locating these pieces in an argument, diagramming them out, and then really trying to unpack the relationships. If you've got any questions at all about how this model works or how it might be applied to a specific argument you're looking at, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.